everyone. Welcome to the first audiovisual episode of The Bridge. As you all know, your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome. I've been presenting this program as a radio program for the last 7 years on US Arab Radio, and now we are shifting to an audiovisual format for The Bridge, which is a bridge connecting different cultures, civilizations, faith traditions, and communities. And it's really my honor and pleasure to have with me in this very important discussion about the US elections, the stakes for Arab Americans and the Arab world, a very prominent expert in the field of politics and specifically Arab American relations. Khalil Jahshan is the executive director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. He's a prominent writer, scholar, and expert. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sahar. Appreciate it. It's good to be with you, and congratulations on the new format.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Let's start first by talking about this unique election, right? A lot of people are talking about this has been, in some people's words or terms, between brackets, an unprecedented election in so many ways. What do you consider to be particularly unique or unprecedented about it?
Frankly, the November 3rd election is unique in many, many respects. When you look at it, it's not happening in a vacuum, first of all. It's happening in a context of, first of all, a global pandemic that has affected our daily lives throughout the world, but specifically also here in the United States, where more than 1 million Americans have been affected or infected actually by this virus. More than 220,000 of our fellow Americans have died as a result since the beginning of the year. And it has impacted the life of the nation here in Washington in many respects. So this is an event we haven't seen in almost like 100 years. So in that sense, these elections are happening in a very unique way, almost as a form of referendum on the handling of this pandemic. Second, of course, is the economic crisis that was generated mostly by this pandemic, and whatever gains are claimed by the administration or others over the past several years seem to have been erased as a result of the pandemic. So we are in the midst of, as a nation, we are in the midst of an economic crisis we haven't seen in a long, long time. A lot of people are unemployed. A lot of people are hurting economically as a result of this crisis. So that impacts elections. Particularly, we know that the economy impacts elections in this country, and Americans tend to vote their pocketbook. So it remains to be seen how that will impact that. Third, and I think most importantly, is that most of us in this country tend to look, whether we are right, center, or left, tend to look at the current situation as threatening to our democratic practices. Again, whether we agree or disagree on domestic or foreign policies, most Americans tend to value, if you will, appreciate the fact that there are certain democratic practices that are allowed to us, certain rights, certain privileges that we did not enjoy, let's say in our countries of origin, but for those of us who are immigrants, or other countries in terms of the world setting. Yet we feel at this time, most of us feel that this is being threatened somehow. The populism that is spreading again worldwide, and it's showing its ugly head here in the States. The events we have seen over the past few months in terms of racism and the lack of effective handling of this challenge that we are facing. All of this is coming home to roost right at the time of this election. So it is definitely a unique election, in at least on these three counts.
Absolutely, and there's also the racial violence, right? All the the Black Lives Matter and all the attention and the police brutality, the huge demonstrations and protests we have been witnessing. That also adds, I'm sure, to the complexity, right, of this very unique picture. But yet, despite all of that, I just want to discuss this point a little bit more. there are those who are still, believe it or not, they're still, supporting the Trump administration and the way Trump has been handling things and still saying, oh, we want 4 more years under Trump. How do you explain this phenomenon?
Again, as you know, Dr. Sahar, and as most of your audience knows, these elections happening in a vacuum. U.S. society in general has never been as polarized as over the past 4 years. For those of us, particularly like you and I, who happen to live in the Washington, D.C. area, this is even a lot more visible here than it is outside the Beltway or throughout the country, far away from Washington, D.C. But this polarization has divided the country in no uncertain terms. The two camps are almost irreconcilably divided right now, even over simple issues like sunrise being in the east and sunset in the west. You will get a public opinion survey showing a kind of a deep divide in American society over everything. So with that in mind, I have a feeling that about 30+% of American society, for political or ideological reasons, sometimes even psychological reasons, are stuck in their commitment to Mr. Trump and their commitment to the Republican Party, even though he's really not a Republican, doesn't represent Republican ideals, but they seem to be totally committed to him. That hasn't changed. It hasn't budged. So this certain percentage of approval that he has been getting has stayed steady. On the other hand, you got an equal camp, slightly larger maybe, of people on the progressive side or the left side of the equation who would like to see change at any price. They will not necessarily vote at all for keeping him for another term. Some of them might not be as excited about the candidate on the Democratic side, but for the sake of change that they are pursuing, they seem to be determined to do that. My statistics, or in looking at public opinion polls, it looks to me like as of this date, almost 87 to 89% of the American public has already made up its mind as to who to vote for. This is unique. I mean, you get a certain percentage every time we have elections that makes up makes up its mind early, but not to that extent, because of this polarization that is so divisive at this time.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. And we also have the early voting. We have almost 49 million Americans who already went to the polls in person in early voting, or they sent their mail-in ballots. This is also unprecedented, isn't it?
It is unprecedented. As a matter of fact, the 49 plus, probably as of today, I mean, that was like a couple hours ago. So it's probably already exceeded 50 million. That definitely supersedes what we have seen in 2016 or 2018, or in recent history, as a matter of fact. We haven't had such large numbers of early voting. But again, this is also impacted by the pandemic. The fact of the matter, we all know that we can't go to the polls under normal, as if we are under normal circumstances because of the pandemic and the danger that public gatherings represent to us individually. So people are opting to vote early, to vote in the mail, to vote indirectly, in order to, first of all, fulfill their responsibility and their duty as active citizens of this country, at the same time protect themselves.
Absolutely. But I think also we might talk about another very important point, which is also the fact that Trump has been talking about this quote unquote, elections fraud. And there can be fraud because of mail-in ballots, which are not really founded claims. There's no evidence to support such claims. But I think a lot of people are scared that if the margin is small between the two candidates at the end of the day, there can be more room for Trump to say, oh, there was fraud. So maybe more people are trying to vote early to try to stop these kinds of claims or to try to make the race more clear at the end. Do you think this could be another reason?
Frankly, I mean, as a long time student of American politics over the past 5 decades, and as an analyst of American politics, I find that somewhat kind of strange. On the one hand, scientifically, we have absolutely no evidence that vote in absentee voting or voting by mail is prone to, large, if you will, or extensive fraud. That has never happened before. It has been investigated many, many times before. There is no scientific evidence to point in that direction. But we've never had a president that is willing to publicly challenge and indirectly undermine the system, if you will, immediately before the election by raising questions about the accuracy, if you will, and the independence of voting system in this country. How that is going to impact the average voter on November 3rd, but it is apt to have some impact long term in undermining the electoral process and the legitimacy of the electoral process in this country. I don't remember in more than 50 years of living in this country, since I immigrated here, I don't remember at all a president challenging the credibility of the system as we have witnessed with Mr. Trump. At the same time, you look at it just in our own immediate vicinity here, there seems to be some questionable acts on the part of his followers to actually try to undermine. The most, I think, worrisome aspect of this is attempts in some particularly conservative and Republican counties and states where attempts are being made to suppress the vote. I find that to be very undemocratic, very un-American, and very dangerous for the future of democracy in this country. By trying to limit the ability of poor people who might not have access to a car or to transportation, public transportation, making it very difficult to even go drop their envelope, their vote, at a polling station, because they are limiting these stations. They are making them so distant apart and less accessible to average citizens. So it is the Trump camp that seems to be trying to create fraud, if you will, or raise questions about the credibility of the elections rather than the
There
voters.
were also incidents where, in California, there were some boxes that were placed, just to mislead people, thinking that this is, the voting box, and you go and you put your ballot, and then it turns out it's not a voting box. So if there is fraud, it is not really caused by the quote unquote the voters or by the system or by mail-in ballots, but it's caused by those who try to create. I totally agree with you. These situations where there can be fraud by putting in, fake boxes and this kind of stuff. So all of these, factors together really paint this unique and pretty much unprecedented picture in a very different and very unique election. So before we move on to our topic, really, which is specifically zooming in on the Arab American community, I just wanted to really give us an idea about your own evaluation of the overall performance of both Trump and Biden so far in terms of their own presidential campaigns in general, and in terms of their performance in the first and the second presidential debate in particular.
I think the first debate, as most observers have already reached a decision, from day one, was a disaster. It was a disaster in the sense that it was too confrontational. It was not democratic at all. And it was not informative. I mean, the purpose of these debates is to inform the public, to inform the electorate about the positions of the two candidates. So if we end up with a shouting match, you're a liar, no, you are a liar, there is very little that the electors, people participating in the elections are going to benefit from that type of useless match. So the first round, I think, was a disaster. It did not help. I definitely, I would, like everybody else, consider the fact that Biden was maybe a bit more more under control during that debate than Trump. But Trump was totally out of control, and he realized that. And apparently, the training and the advice of his the campaign, forced him to change. He was like a totally different man. I mean, watching him last night, I would say, hey, would the real Mr. Trump please stand up? I mean, he didn't even resemble his usual self. You would wonder what happened. And he was a bit more disciplined. He tried to focus on some of the issues, but frankly, he left a lot to be desired in terms of accuracy and in terms of the truth. He has this tendency as a politician to fudge the truth, to exaggerate numbers, to exaggerate achievements. Whether he's right or wrong on some of the issues is beyond the point, but this tendency to always distort facts and numbers shows that he is very careless about the truth. And that has, I think, impacted his numbers, definitely not necessarily in terms of the hardcore extreme right that I referred to earlier, but definitely in terms of independence and in terms of certain categories where we have seen or witnessed an erosion of support for him, particularly among the elderly and among women and among suburbanites.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if I was to ask you a direct question, I hope you don't mind me asking it, who do you think is going to be winning this unprecedented and unique election at the end of the day, and why?
That's a tough question. I mean, you and I come from part of the world that has generated profits over history, but I do not practice prophecy. At the same time, I don't mind as an analyst look, if you asked me that question about 2-3 months ago, I would have said that the elections are going to be so tight, it would be impossible to know. It's even in terms of the prospects for the success of either candidate. But as of today, when I look at the numbers, the shifting that has taken place in numbers, popularity-wise, in terms of the popular vote, and in terms of the prospects for even the Electoral College, once we get to that process after the election, I would feel more comfortable that the current gap of 8 to 10% between the two candidates is very, very difficult to reverse at this late stage. So my guess is that from the numbers I have in front of me with regards to the popular vote and with regards to the Electoral College anticipation in terms of estimates, I would say that the chances for the Democratic candidate for Biden to win the elections on Tuesday, November 3rd, are probably 80-1 in favor of Biden.
And we also saw, percentages and polls that indicate that also after the second presidential debate, there were like differences of sometimes 11 points and sometimes up to 14 points between the two candidates. So that also, I think, strengthens this point or this prediction. We'll come back to this very interesting discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
تضرعنا إلى الوهاب أعطانا ولم يبخل وحين نجيء نحو الباب باب الله لم يقفل وإنا حين نمنحهم فلم ينقص لنا مال فإن الخير مدخر لمن منحوا وإن زاد.
أطعم جائعا من خلال لايف.
Back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and this is The Bridge. And with me today is a political analyst and expert, executive director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., Khalil Jahshan. Thank you so much again for joining us in this very important and timely discussion. Let's zoom in now on the Arab American community in particular, and then we'll keep the Arab world as a whole to our last segment or last part of this discussion. Can we talk about, quote unquote, somehow homogeneous or some kind of uniform, united Arab American community that has a certain preference or a certain agenda when it comes to this election? Or should we talk about similarities and differences at the same time, and why?
I think it's very difficult to talk about a totally united, Arab American community politically. Frankly, particularly for those of us who are immigrants from the Arab world, forget about those of us who were born in this country. They seem to be a little bit more immune to that. But a lot of us who immigrated to this country were influenced by the yearning in the Arab world for unity. And we kind of brought that with us here. And we tried. I mean, I remember in my early days as an activist in the Arab American community, the years I've spent at AAUG and NAAA and ADC, and not only as official of these organizations, but as a member of many other organizations. The attempt was always made to try to kind of create a joint, if you will, platform, particularly in times of elections, to try to rally the community behind a set of principles. And we used to have something that jokingly we used to call the 11th commandment. In addition to the 10th commandment that most of us are aware of, we used to consider the need to try to avoid allowing divisions in the Arab world to kind of penetrate, if you will, the Arab American community or psyche and divide us in this country. We were not, in the long term, we were not totally successful, but for certain periods of time, I think we were, and that was helpful. But frankly, living in a democratic society like the United States, where the emphasis is on individual rights, on freedom of speech, on freedom to affiliate with any party of your choice, it's very difficult to talk about unity, even for an ethnic community that feels besieged sometimes and endangered, whether on the domestic level or on the foreign policy level. I think what we have done over the years, my own guess is that having been involved for more than 40 years in the Arab American community and Arab American politics, I see a little bit more sophistication over the years where we can differ, yet we can coordinate. We can agree on general principles, but different perspectives. I might have a different perspective on Palestine than others, a different perspective on Egypt than others, a different perspective on Lebanon than others. But at the same time, we can all maybe unite in terms of support for a member of Congress that we want to support jointly, or a president we would like to endorse jointly. So it has become a little bit easier, and because of that growing sophistication on the part of the younger generation, particularly for the immigrant community, it was easier for those who were born here to do that. But it took a while, I think, for the immigrant community to overcome, if you will, the regional differences of origin, country of origin or country of birth, and so on, and act more as an Arab American. So the situation is not perfect today. It's not ideal. There is no per se, like I can't really honestly say there is a solid Arab vote. It's very difficult to prove that. But there is a general tendency. I mean, I can with honesty tell you that the bulk, the majority of Arab voters in this country would vote this way or that way in certain circumstances, particularly with regards to presidential elections. But it's not for us to be 100% in unison, voting for this candidate or that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be living in a democratic country.
Correct. But can you just, maybe give us your own hunch or prediction, maybe, or estimation as to the overall mode or agenda, if there is one quote unquote agenda, maybe for the Arab American community? Can we talk about quote unquote a unifying agenda? Can we talk maybe about a more, favorable candidate, a more likely candidate to get the Arab American vote, and why?
Well, first of all, I think the Arab American community in general is a multifaceted community. It has its own internal dynamics, politically, socially, economically. and that impacts its positions. For example, we tend to be a very successful community economically in this country. And usually economic success, like owning your own business, certain professions, the medical profession, for example, engineering and so on, being a businessman and things of that sort tend to drive one politically in this country toward the middle and toward even the right. So people become status quo oriented when they become independent economically. Immigrants, when they come first to the country, they are seeking acceptance. They are seeking protection for their civil and political rights and human rights. They are impacted by discrimination. So they tend to drift to the party that is most open to them and most supportive of them. So they tend to go to the left. They tend to go to the Democratic Party. So generally speaking, definitely for over the years, most Arab American immigrants have drifted to the Democratic Party and have voted for Democratic candidates. The born here, regardless of country of origin, that tended to be successful, very successful, the rich, let's say, of the Arab American community, the top, let's say, 5 or 10% of the well-to-do Arab Americans tended to be Republicans. So when you have a moderate Republican, when you look over the years, you look at certain moderate Republicans that tended to appeal on either economic or moral grounds to the community, tended to get more, I would say, Arab American Republican votes than today. But when you have a radical right, the Arab American community is not comfortable with the radical right because it tends to be racist. It tends to be anti-immigrant. It tends to be discriminatory. It tends to be violent. It tends to engage in war, particularly in the region. So for a community that is not a one-issue oriented community, you have to take that into consideration when you evaluate the general trends within an ethnic community of like almost 4 million people, plus, of course, the Muslim community that we affiliate with. That kind of also goes through the same process, if you will, plus those who were born here, second, third, fourth generation even. So there are, it's a diverse community with an internal dynamic that need to be taken into consideration when one analyzes the political trends within such community.
Absolutely, but it seems from what you just said now, your answers, that there is some kind of maybe preference for the Democratic candidate among maybe most, we can say most of the Arab American community, for all the different reasons you mentioned, economically and socially. They will tend to affiliate themselves more with this kind of quote unquote moderate or center agenda for all the reasons you mentioned. You said
I think so, and I think the Arab vote will be, if there is something we can refer to as the Arab vote, based on what I said earlier, I would say it would be a higher percentage this time than the 60 to 70% we have seen in the past going to the Democratic candidate. I think we might see a much higher percentage this time going to Biden because of the combination of all these domestic issues and unrest that we talked about, plus the foreign policy concerns that are happening today. So that doesn't preclude a segment of the community. They're there. You see them. You and I do a lot of media, and we run into Arab Americans speaking on behalf of Trump and enthusiastically supporting him. I mean, that's their right to do so. We differ with them. We argue with them. We debate issues with them. But there is still a percentage in the community that, unfortunately, from my personal perspective, still are holding on to that perspective.
Absolutely, even among the Muslim American community, right? Yes. Trump, as a candidate said, quote unquote, Islam hates us, right? I remember I was in an airport and I just looked up to the screen. I was stunned. I was like, oh my God, did I hear that right? Like Islam hates us. And yet there is a small percentage of Muslim Americans who are, going to vote for Trump. So again, like you just said, we cannot really say everyone is going to vote this way, but we can predict the majority. You mentioned something very important.
Yeah, may I just add one more thing? It's not directly related to your question, but I think it's very important for your audience to notice that this time I am sensing a deeper division between us as a community, the Arab American - Muslim American community in this country, and our fellow Arabs in the Arab world. There seems to be a lot more support for Trump in certain Arab countries than you're going to get in the Arab American community on November 3rd. And that is kind of uncomfortable for both sides, Arab Americans and for Arabs in the Arab world. They don't seem to understand the logic of us taking a democratic decision in a democratic country and practicing, if you will, our right, free expression and right for the candidate of our choice, because they don't have democracy. And it's very difficult for us to think. I mean, how could, in the context of what you just referred to, the anti-Arab, anti-Islam, how could an Arab country support this candidate, particularly those who claim championing, the cause, the Arab cause or Muslim causes? It is mind-boggling, but that schism seems to be increasing this time.
Absolutely, and unfortunately, this is very true. My question was about really coalition building. You mentioned something about coalition building. There's more coalition building, especially among the younger generations. Are you generally satisfied with the amount of coalition building and alliance building within the Arab American community, and also the level of political engagement? When I say political engagement, I mean whether in terms of voting or in terms of running for office. Like a lot of people would say, why couldn't we have more, like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, these, Arab American, congresswomen? Why don't we see more of that? So what is your take on these issues?
That's a very loaded question. Frankly, having spent so many years working within the Arab American community, I've never been satisfied with the level of political involvement. I've always blamed the weakness of the Arab cause, quote unquote, in the United States, and put the blame on lack of participation. Lack of participation, particularly among the immigrant component of our community. They do not come here from democratic countries where political efficacy and participation in political parties and in the democratic process, they ain't got one in the old country. So they come here, and it takes them a generation, sometimes more, to adjust to that and to see the validity of that type of involvement. Sometimes, like you said, the younger generation, yes, of course, because they are born here, they grow up here, so they become American born, and they understand the system a little bit better than their parents or grandparents. But generally speaking, our involvement has been limited. Not only, because involvement doesn't have to be just on the national level. I'm talking about Arab American. For example, what is the largest Arab American organization in this country? People numbers are fungible, and people play around with numbers and claim to have hundreds of thousands of followers. But frankly, I've never seen an Arab American organization grow beyond 20 to 30,000 people, including, by the way, the social organizations like the ethnic organizations or village-based organizations like the Ramallah Federations and so on. So, I've never seen an organization claim to represent more than, let's say, 30 to 40,000. From a community of 3 to 4 million people, especially when you compare it with other ethnic groups, like compare it to the Jewish community. The Jewish community is about twice our size, let's say, a little bit less now. And yet, when you look at their involvement, out of that 5.8 million American Jews, you find at least 2 million who belong to organizations that represent their interests. We don't get, we are half of their size, but we don't get half of their involvement. So there is a challenge, remaining challenge for Arab Americans and Muslim Americans to get involved more. It's getting better. I'm very encouraged by the younger generation and their commitment. even though they probably lack the let's say, not the sophistication, but they lack the substantive knowledge of issues that older generations had, particularly with regards to foreign policy and involvement in foreign policy issues. We're getting a little friction right now between young generation within certain groups, both Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, who feel uncomfortable about positions being taken by certain national groups. But that's normal. That's what politics is all about. It is a tug of war internally within the community, and in a democratic way, let the truth prevail.
Absolutely. What would you say are some of the most important challenges or obstacles that prevent or inhibit more engagement, more involvement on the part of the Arab American community in American politics, whether it's voting in an election or whether it is running for office? When I say running for office, I mean the local level, the state level, or even the national level. What are some of the obstacles and challenges there?
Yeah. Again, like I said, when I look at it comparatively speaking, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I remember the days when people on the left and on the right would try to get involved in the process. And the most basic things, like, for example, write a check to a candidate. Some candidates used to return Arab and Muslim checks back, say, we don't take Arab money, as if somehow Arab American dollar is less than a non-Arab American dollar. We had very prominent people. I mean, I remember specifically very prominent people in the community. James Abu-Rizq, who became senator later, he gave a check to one of the Kennedy kids when he ran for Congress, and he knew his dad and donated, and the check was returned. So those days, I think, are gone. Occasionally, you see some acts of ignorance or discrimination or racism displayed here and there in some campaigns, but it's a lot less frequent. In terms of running for office, I think, again, there is improvement, but frankly, when you look at it 10 years or 15 years ago, for example, we had more members in Congress who were of Arab American origin than now. So why the drop in numbers? I think the socioeconomic background of our community, particularly our immigrant community, tends to be less oriented toward public service. We like business. We like particularly private enterprise. We excel at that, but we do not excel at public service. We do not see. That's why, in my previous incarnations, I always encouraged young Arab Americans to intern in Congress, to intern at the White House, to intern, in think tanks, and so on. I continue to do that. I love having interns at the Arab Center today, because once you somehow get our young people hooked on politics and on public service, you hope that they will continue to do that, and in the future maybe run for office and represent their own community. There is an increase, by the way. Again, this is not a scientific poll, but I see a lot more Arabic and Muslim names among the staffers in Congress. That's important. We're making some progress there, but it hasn't translated into members yet. When for a community our size, it would be good to have a few more members of Congress, particularly on the Senate side these days.
Absolutely, I totally agree, and inshallah to that, right? We hope and pray that this is going to be.
Inshallah.
We'll come back to this very interesting discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
يا طفل غزة إننا لم ننسى حزنك ها هنا، كل الصعاب تعيشها ولنا النعيم بذي الحياة، يدعوننا بالحب لا ترضى أبدا أن يبور ماء الحياة ونورها عن وجهك الحلو المنير.
back to The Bridge, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and we're talking today about US elections and the stakes for Arab Americans and for the Arab world. And with me today, my distinguished guest, Khalil Jahshan, Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a political analyst, writer, and scholar. So I have a question also about what would a Trump second term or a Biden first term look like for minorities in general and Arab Americans in particular?
I think, generally speaking, if Trump is re-elected, he will interpret that vote as a vote of confidence, as a vote basically in support of his previous idiosyncrasies and policies, and he will do more of the same. That's my anticipation, and the anticipation of most experts, whether they support him or not, who look at his mindset, his career, and his behavior as president. So the policies we have seen are going to not only remain the same, nothing remains the same. There will be changes in a second term Trump. There will be changes maybe for the worse in some aspects, in the sense that, like I said, he would be seeing or considering the vote as a vote of confidence. He will this time, I'm sure, become a little bit more sophisticated in picking his team. But that has a price for the public. He will pick a team this time that is more to his liking, that is like-minded, that is more in agreement with than the previous, let's say, team that he had before. So there will be no adults in charge in the classroom this time. There will be more Trump enablers at the White House than we have seen in the past. So domestically, I think he hasn't changed his mind one bit with regards to condescension toward ethnic groups, inability to deal with people who have different perspectives than he does. And of course, the many issues on foreign policy that we differ with him, specifically in terms of democracy and human rights in the Arab world, which we enjoy in this country up to a certain extent. And we would like our friends, our brothers and sisters in the Arab world to also enjoy. But you don't expect that to be advocated by a second term Trump. He will continue to associate, affiliate, and befriend dictators and human rights abusers across the board, and that's not to our liking. If Biden wins, I think you could tell his platform is a little bit more detailed, so you can, put your finger on some changes that he will definitely undertake. It will be a typical Democratic administration that is more open to ethnic communities, more respectful of the aspirations of ethnic community like immigrant community like the Arab American community, definitely more receptive toward immigration and immigration issues, less racist in terms of religious discrimination and the animosity toward Islam, for example. And of course, when we say Islam, that discrimination and racism doesn't stem from necessarily knowledge, it stems from ignorance. So you and I, even though we belong to two different religions, but we are considered the same as far as these people are concerned. So I would expect some serious changes in both domestic and foreign policy. It will not be ideal. I happen to know the candidate well. I dealt with him when I used to run the National Association of Arab Americans, and we did lobbying on Capitol Hill. I knew Senator Biden very well. As a matter of fact, I even debated and at one point participated in panels with him on a couple of occasions on Middle East policy. I know his limitations, I know his weaknesses, but I know his strengths, and I hope that he will deliver on those commitments that he directly or his staff have made to the Muslim and to the Arab American communities of late, and that we will see some positive change should he be elected on November 3rd.
Absolutely. Especially this is going to impact not just the Arab American community, but all different minority groups, right? The files or the issues related to immigration, to human rights, to police brutality, to economic issues, social issues. All of that is going to be impacted hugely by whether we get a second Trump term or a first Biden term. Let's now shift to the very important international or foreign relations aspect of this discussion. Really, the impact of a second Trump term or a first Biden term on the Arab world more broadly. Like looking at the Middle East, looking at the Arab world, what do you expect to be the impact if Trump wins or if Biden wins?
Again, I think similar to the pattern I just described the previous answer, I expect a second term Trump will continue the current policies. Some people say, well, he will be a little bit more comfortable with his position, a little bit more assured with a second victory, and he might be able to do something creative. I just don't see it, frankly. I think it will be more of the same, generally speaking. He will continue to handpick his friends that tend to be authoritarian. He seems to be an aspiring authoritarian, and all his friends in the region tend to be like-minded. He is comfortable with that type of leaders, and that is not unique to just the Middle East. I mean, everywhere you go, whether it's Latin America or Europe or whatever, he has populist tendencies, and he likes people that engage in populist politics. And that is not positive in terms of improving U.S. credibility in an unstable region like the Middle East. Two, his tendency to be a transactional president will continue, probably will increase. And frankly, doing business is one thing, doing politics is a totally different thing. And that has been his main weakness during the first term, and unfortunately it will be his main weakness during the second term. He doesn't surround himself with serious experts on our region, which he needs. It's a very diverse region, particularly on complex issues like the conflict in Palestine, the conflict in Yemen, the conflict in Syria, the conflict in Iraq, the conflict in Libya. He has not been well served by the shallow advice he's been getting, both by some inexperienced national security staff at the White House and by a State Department that has been somehow neutralized and whose expertise has not been put to the test, if you will, in trying to impact policy. So I expect that to continue, and unfortunately that would be disastrous, as I said, to U.S. national interest. As American citizens, we would like to, even though we differ with some of these interests, we'd like to tweak him, make him a little bit better, make him more equitable in serving the interest of our Arab allies in the region, but mostly the Arab people. So since most of us are committed to democracy, civil rights, human rights, women's rights in the Arab world, I just don't see that as improving under Trump. And under Biden, I think, like I said, there is more promise in that respect. And I hope that that promise will materialize and more members of the Arab American community will be involved. And I do expect maybe a few Arab Americans to be in key positions at state and national security as advisors in a democratic administration. And I hope that they will have an impact on the policy.
Absolutely. I think some people even predict that a second Trump term will not be the same. It's going to be a lot worse. He's going to be unhinged. He doesn't care anymore. He doesn't really want to seek anybody's approval or acceptance because, this is his second and final term. So they expect even disastrous results, whether domestically or regionally or internationally. And of course, when you talk about he doesn't have experts around him, like look at who is choosing to be his, liaison for Middle East peace, right? His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, I don't think he does have any kind of credentials in terms of political expertise or diplomatic, skills. So definitely, I agree with you on that. You are a Palestinian American, and I cannot help but ask you about the impact of the outcome of this very important election on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We have seen lately, these signings of treaties, agreements between countries like Bahrain and the Emirates and lately Sudan and Israel. How is that going to play out if we have a second Trump term or if we have a first Biden term?
I think it would be disastrous for both U.S. Interests in the region and also for, let's say, the rights of the Palestinian people that continue to live under military Israeli occupation, considering the steps that have been taken over the past 4 years by the Trump administration, showing total bias, but beyond the usual. I mean, look, U.S. policy has always been biased toward Israel from day one. But we have never seen a president or an administration that has taken sides totally with not the Israeli mainstream position, but with the radical extreme position in Israel that's represented by Netanyahu and his government. So what has happened over the past 3-4 years is nothing less. Some people might think this is an exaggeration, but I don't think so. I've been an observer of U.S. policy since my college student years, in the 60s. U.S. policy, as I said, has always been biased, but it has never been a declaration of war against the Palestinians. This administration has declared war on the Palestinians. So I wouldn't blame Palestinians, public and authority at this time in hoping that there will be a change in Washington, because they have given up. And it's kind of funny because, frankly, I mean, I've had this argument with Palestinian leaders last time, or 2 times actually. They met with Trump and they were impressed. And I just couldn't understand frankly, the rationale for being impressed. They thought he was blunt, he was forceful, he was kind of assertive, and they thought, hey, he might do something positive. But then, boom, I mean, within weeks, he stabbed them in the back totally without any warning whatsoever. And they are still in shock. I mean, I'm talking about leaders at the highest levels, okay? And they haven't recovered from that. He's a traditional U.S. politician with regards to the Middle East, with regards to the Arab-Israeli conflict, with regards to the Palestine question. He believes in the two-state solution. Trump doesn't. The two-state solution has failed in the past. That doesn't mean it has to fail in the future. At least he is a believer in give and take. He doesn't believe in annexation. He doesn't believe in continued aggressive settlement in Palestinian territories. So I think, these are nuances, but they are important nuances. We cannot continue to downplay them. And considering how bad we have come over the past 3-4 years in handling the Palestine issue, I think these types of changes, resuming at least relations with the Palestinians, resuming humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, considering the dismal economic situation under Corona right now, the pandemic in Gaza and in the West Bank, I think such changes would be welcome and would be useful.
We'll come back to this very interesting discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
تضرعنا إلى الوهاب أعطانا ولم يبخل وحين نجيء نحو الباب باب الله لم يقفل وإنا حين نمنحهم فلم ينقص لنا مال فإن الخير مدخر لمن منحوا وإن زاد.
أطعم جائعا من خلال لايف.
Welcome back to The Bridge, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis. We're talking today about U.S. elections and the stakes for the Arab American community and for the Arab world. And with me today, a distinguished guest, Khalil Jahshan, the Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and an expert on Arab American politics. I cannot help but ask in the remaining minutes we have really about the future of these signings of agreements, right? The treaties between, Israel and, Bahrain and Emirates, and now we have Sudan. And other countries are expected to join. There's expectation for Saudi Arabia and Morocco, Mauritania, other countries. How do you perceive this? How is it going to play out? Like, if Trump wins or if Biden wins?
It is unfortunate that these countries have decided to do that in that particular manner. I mean, eventually, people did anticipate that should the Palestine question be resolved peacefully and the Palestinians get their rights and have a state of their own with Jerusalem as its capital and so on, according to international law, that somehow the Arab countries would probably normalize. I mean, it's not new that since the 2002, we've had something called the Arab Peace Initiative offering that type of peace to Israel, but under certain conditions. Now it seems to me that number one, there is this rush to reward not just Israel, but to reward the most radical government in the history of Israel without getting anything back in return. That's not what diplomacy is. This is what stupidity is. So I'm a bit worried about this new alliance that's emerging because, frankly, for example, particularly with regards to the UAE agreement with Israel, this is not just normalization. This is an alliance. That has never happened before. Even countries like Egypt and Jordan that have recognized Israel for their own, agendas and to save their own national interest and so on over the years, they never rushed to that extent in striking an alliance. And their public has been left to kind of refuse, if you will, that normalization. But that's not what's happening in this regard. With regards to, frankly, Bahrain was almost like a gift because Saudi Arabia couldn't do it and can't do it at this time. So they kind of offered Bahrain as a sacrifice, if you will, to please Trump. But what is worrisome is the fact that it was used in this country for political reasons, even though scientifically, I don't think it's going to make one damn piece of difference on November 3rd. Sudan, unfortunately, is blackmail par excellence. Sudan is welcome to take any sovereign decision it wants to. But frankly, considering how broke it is and the serious difficulties it's facing, being removed from the SST, the state sponsors of terrorism, is long overdue. It should happen, but it should happen on its own merits. It has nothing to do with normalizations with Israel. And this administration, it seems to me, the president included, and particularly the Secretary of State, seem to confuse their role as if they are the Secretary of State of the State of Israel. That has nothing to do with U.S. interest, and I think it will come back to haunt them when you particularly consider our research that has proven that a majority in the Arab world, the masses, the public, continue to oppose unconditional normalization and alliance with Israel short of solving the Palestine question. Yes to peace.
It seems that there is freezing in the video. Can you repeat the last sentence, please? You said yes to peace.
I think the public opinion is very clear in the Arab countries right now. It shows about 80 plus 84%, according to Arab Opinion Index conducted by the Arab Center in more than 12 Arab countries with a population of surveyed population of about 28,000 people. It's the largest survey ever conducted on an annual basis in the Arab world. It shows that 85% average in the Arab world are against normalization with Israel without solving the Palestine question. In other words, what they are saying to me is yes to peace, but no to surrender. So should Israel move forward, reciprocate, and recognize the Palestinians and give them their rights, end occupation, have a Palestinian state, I think there will be less opposition to that. Even in countries like Saudi Arabia, by the way, the opposition to the agreement is at 69%. So the average is about 88%. The largest country in terms of opposition is Algeria, with 98% opposed to normalization with Israel at this time.
Very good. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Good times always fly quickly. And this has been a very inspirational, very eye-opening and enlightening discussion. Thank you so much, Khalil Jahshan. I really appreciate your participation with us in the first audiovisual episode of The Bridge. Wishing you and wishing Arab Center Washington, D.C., which I'm proud to serve on, as an academic advisory board member, all the success in all your future endeavors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sahar, and best of luck on your program.
Thank you, and thanks to all our viewers everywhere. Thank you, stay safe, stay well, and goodbye.